They've changed all the signage. Well, good evening, everybody, again. First Buddhist women. That's what we're doing tonight. So this is it's a wonderful, wonderful book. I'm going to recap just a little to get where we're going here, and there's a point in recapping. This book draws poems from the Therigatha, which is a set of enlightenment stories by women of their own enlightenment early in the history of Buddhism, so contemporary, largely pretty much contemporary with the Buddha. Stories transmitted orally as verse. It begins with Mahaprajapati, who was Buddha's stepmom, and then her disciples, many of whom were actually from Buddha's harem. Then we go to Pattakara, who was one of the most remarkable of the people, and her disciples. And then we move into wanderers and disciples, sort of ascetics, which was a dangerous practice for women at that time, and a very inappropriate practice in the culture. And then wise women and teachers, which is going back to the string of the hardcore of the people who followed closely and had their disciples. And then we get into mothers, wives, prostitutes, courtesans, and beautiful women, friends and sisters, looking at women by descriptor, by identifying them in a role, in a social role. Mothers, wives, old men, prostitutes, courtesans, beautiful women, friends, and sisters. So they're functions and they're in a social role. And as we get into the poems, you'll see that role showing up quite a lot. So if I go to the right place. So mothers. The poems, so there's two things that the poems draw from the woman's experience of being a mother and also from the cultural stories around that role. And an awful lot of these stories, something like 15 or 20% of the stories in the Therigatha, there's 80 or 90 stories altogether, 80 or 90 poems, something like 15 or 20% of them are anchored on a female experience of a mother losing a child. And this shows up in cultures around the world. The book makes reference to Demeter and Persephone, which is the Greek myth where Persephone was wandering around in the fields, and she comes to this beautiful little white flower, and she reaches down to pick it up. The earth opens up, and Hades hauls her down. And Demeter is just distraught, and she's Mother Earth. She's the harvest, and she's prepared to let everything die. She wants her daughter back. So Zeus and Hades cut a deal, and she gets her half the year. And then it alludes to Mary's grief, which is not really talked about in the Bible, but it became such an anchor in so much of Christianity, Mary's grief over the death of her son. So this leads into this whole build, that arc builds up in this book into the cult of the mother. And what that is about, it's really important here because it becomes a couple of contradictions that I want to play around with. So motherly love as the prototype of all love. Here's a quote, which is actually a text about Tibetan Buddhism. I think it's a contemporary text about Tibetan Buddhism, but here's a quote I want to read to you. If we contemplate on our own mother's kindness towards us, our fondness for her will grow. Before our birth, we were protected and preciously carried in her womb. We were in a state of total helplessness and complete dependence. Our presence there was not only a great physical burden to her, but was also a responsibility curtailing her freedom of action. When eating, walking, sitting, or sleeping, she was constrained to be mindful of our presence and welfare. This she did joyfully. At birth, we gave great suffering to our mother, yet she forgot this at once and rejoiced as though she had found a precious gem. We had no control over our physical functions, yet she felt no revulsion towards our vomit or excretions and cared for us gently. When she looked at us and spoke our name, she did so in a special way. Her tenderness was not in response to some kindness we had shown her, but was the result of her enormous compassion. Without her constant attention, we would not be alive now. She did not do so in hope of repayment, nor because she was compelled to do so. When it was a question of her personal benefit and ours, she sacrificed her own benefits and well-being. So this is picked up in the Metta Sutta, where, if you remember the line in the middle of the Metta Sutta, as a mother would protect her only child, her only child, even so one should cultivate a limitless heart. Even so one should protect a limitless heart with regard to all beings. So that's saying the tenderness that the mother has for the child is the same tenderness we should use for this limitless heart, not the other beings, but the limitless heart that holds all beings. And this then goes on through the rest of the verses to talk about, and through this cultivation, whether standing, walking, sitting, or lying down, wherever one is, one no more rests in the womb, one no more lies in the womb, so one will never be reborn. One is free, one is liberated by this very cultivation of this very motherly love, this role, this idealized love. So there's a real contradiction in here, though, because it's held up as this ideal, and yet women in this culture could not be enlightened. You could only be enlightened when you're reborn as a man. And women were very much inferior. If a woman did not have a child and become a mother, she was worthless. And to be born in a woman's body was considered a cause for special suffering around menstruation, which was isolation. That was a terrible thing. The menopause and childbirth, all these horrible things that happened to women's bodies, which caused women to be outcasts in a sense. And yet it was such a wonderful role model. And then the other one is the one we talked about in the Metta Sutta, which is it's being idealized as this motherly love, as this wonderful thing that all love should be based upon. And yet the purpose of the practice is to escape rebirth, to become free, and so not to need to be reborn. So why are we talking about this in the context of a mother having a child in the first place? It's kind of a contradiction. There's a contemporary story, which is Deepa Ma. And there's a book that I'm hoping we recently received the Wednesday evening list of upcoming books. Which ones do we want to read? And one of them is the story of Deepa Ma. So I hope that one's chosen. It's just a remarkable story. But Deepa Ma's story is a pretty horrible story. It's a wonderful story. What happy ending, but horrible story to get there. And Deepa Ma, if you don't know, she was this 20th century. She was a student of Munindra at the end of it, Munindraji, and she's just this remarkable, extraordinary woman, just extraordinary, self-realized teacher. Almost none of her teachings survive. It's just amazing. We've talked about that before here. But her story, she was married. Again, not by her desire. I don't recall if it was actively against her will, but it was certainly
Like 12.
which, thank you, she was really young, so
Yeah.
her consent was irrelevant. But she was married. Fortunately, the husband was not a horrible guy. He didn't rape and molest her and do horrible things. But, she was married to this guy, and she went off to live with her in-laws at the age of 12. And then they moved from India across what is now India, sort of Myanmar, I think, Mumbai, I think. So they moved up the coast and across into what became Bangladesh. So she's moved hundreds or thousands of miles from her family. And for many years, tried and tried to have a child and couldn't. And it just went on and on and on. And finally, when I think she was like 40 years old, when she finally bore a single child, her husband died and left her destitute. And so she came back, and then she went and sat. And oh, suddenly she's like this most remarkable set of enlightenment stories and the most remarkable teaching career. Just the most wonderful woman, but just a horrible, horrible trajectory to get there. So I'm going to jump to a couple of stories, a couple of particular stories here, which I want to focus on. The first one is a story. The person is Vasetti. So she's another one. She was happily married, had a child. When the child died, she went mad and she ran away. And she went wandering around the streets just in this hopeless state. So that's the story. And here's her verse. Grief-stricken for my son, mad-minded, out of my senses. I was naked with wild hair, and I wandered anywhere. I lived on trash heaps, in a graveyard, and by the highways. 3 years wandering, starved and thirsty. Then, in the city of Mittila, I saw the one who tames what is untamed, and he goes on his way in happiness, enlightened, unafraid. Of course, that's the Buddha. I came to my senses, paid homage, and sat down. Out of compassion, Gautama taught me the way. When I heard his words, I set out into homelessness by putting his teachings into practice. I realized great joy. My grief is cut out, finished, ended, for I have understood the ground from which all grief comes. So this is kind of an archetype for so many of the poems in this book, so many of these stories. This grief-stricken woman, desolate over and destitute as a result of the death of a child, who then encounters this spiritual figure. In many cases, it's the Buddha himself. In many cases, it's somebody like Pattakara or Mahaprajapati. And that person that person is an inspiration that brings them into the practice. And then we have this enlightening ending to the poem. The next one is Kisugotami. Kisugotami is a story that you're probably all familiar with. There's a core piece of the story you're all familiar with. She's the one who lost a child, bumped into the Buddha, wailing and distraught with this dead infant in her hands, said, I hear you're a miracle man, please bring my child back. He says, if you go to find me a mustard seed from a house that has never experienced death, I'll bring your child back. And of course, she tries, very quickly realizes that none of these households are free of death. Everybody has experienced death. And so she gets the point. She comes back, takes a child off into the woods and kind of leaves the child, this dead infant, and comes back and becomes a disciple of the Buddha's and goes and joins the women's order. So that's the story we're familiar with. There's a verse here, which I'm not sure where this verse actually comes from, but it's a verse that's somewhere in the first part of this book about Kisugotami. Miserable woman, this pain can't be measured. Your tears have been falling for thousands of lives. And that harks back to me to a conversation Buddha had with Pattakara, which is one of the she's one of the earlier figures in this story, in this book. And she is one of the most well-known of the female teachers and the one who had a very large following of students. She also had lost a child. It was a devastating story. She's the one who she ran away with her husband, had 2 children. Each time she wanted to go home with the child and it didn't work, so she went back. And I can't remember the exact sequence, but her husband died, so she wanted to go back to her parents with the 2 children. She swims across with the infant, leaves it on the other shore, swims back, it's chucking it down with rain, picks up the second child, and as she looks back across the river, the first child is eaten by some wild animal, by a hawk. And so she's swimming the river with the second child. She's so distraught, the second child is taken away from her in the river. So everything's lost. So she's in the same utter distraught place. And she finds the Buddha. Sister, recover your presence of mind, he says. And she recovered her presence of mind. She saw that she was naked. A man threw her his outer robe. Help me, she said to the Buddha, and she told him a terrible story. He replied, Patakara, don't you think you have come to someone who can, excuse me, Patakara, don't think you have come to someone who can help you. In your many lives, you have shed more tears for the dead than there is water in the 4 oceans. This made her grief less heavy. He went on to say that when she herself went into another world, no king could help her, and so on. And then she becomes a disciple, and ultimately there's her enlightenment story as well. But in your many lives, you have shed more tears for the dead than there is water in the 4 oceans. That's what that Kisargotami poem took me back to. There are a couple of poems from Kisargotama in the Therigatha. And I'm going to read a couple of pieces of the first one. No, I'm going to read a couple of pieces from one. And then there's also a poem about her in the Pali Canon. There's a whole section in one of the books of the Pali Canon, which has poems by bhikkhunis and conversations with devas. It's at the beginning of this first book of the Samyutta Nikaya, if you're interested. So here's a couple of extracts from a longer poem, which is by Kisargotami. The guide of a restless, passionate humanity has said, to be a woman is to suffer. To live with co-wives is suffering. Women can give birth and, becoming depressed, cut their throats. Beautiful young women eat poison, but both will suffer in hell when the mother-murdering fetus comes not to life. So that's difficult, ambiguous, and quite unpleasant in many parts. But the framework here is the woman as a possession, and this is in a culture where she's in an affluent society, so she will be a member of a harem, one of many wives of the same man. And there's lots of competition among those wives. When one gets a little older, becomes less beautiful, becomes less attractive, loses their place in the hierarchy. When somebody has a child, there's the consequences, and somebody else has a child, that becomes it's very complicated. So there's lots of jealousy. They slitting of throats, killing each other's children. It's there's lots of little sidebar barbs in this poem. So I'll read it again. And of course, the guide of the restless is Buddha. The guide of a restless, passionate humanity has said, to be a woman is to suffer. To live with co-wives is suffering. Women can give birth and, becoming depressed, cut their throats. Beautiful young women eat poison, can poison each other. But both will suffer in hell when the mother-murdering fetus comes not to life. Now here we get onto the piece that is, I think, a nicer piece. I have practiced the great eightfold way straight to the undying. I have come to the great peace. I have looked into the mirror of the Dharma. The arrow is out. I have put my burden down. What had to be done has been done. Sister Kisargotami, with a free mind, has said this. So that's like her signature line. I have practiced the great eightfold way straight to the undying. I have come to the great peace. I have looked into the mirror of the Dharma. The arrow is out. I have put my burden down. What had to be done has been done. Sister Kisargotami, with a free mind, has said this. So that's and the key words in here, things like straight to the undying. So this is complete release of any birth and death, any clinging, any craving, any sense of desire, straight to the undying. I have come to the great peace, the peace of God, which passeth all understanding. I have looked into the mirror of the Dharma. And the mirror of the Dharma is the mirror that reveals the illusory nature, the non-existence of the self. There's nothing, there's no mirror, and there's no one looking in the mirror. And to look into the mirror of the Dharma is to see that. The arrow is out, which is the second arrow of suffering. I have put my burden down. The burden is any attachment, anything we feel predisposed to hold on to. There's no reason to hold on to anything. This is the Vimalakirti Sutra story again. The arhats, the flower petals fall, land on the arhats, and they stick. The bodhisattvas, the petals fall and they just slide off. Why is that? Because there's nowhere for them to land. There's nowhere for them to stick. I have put my burden down. Suffering happens when we pick a burden up. Suffering with the leaf blower happens when we go out and we pick it up. There's no suffering until we engage with it. I have put my burden down. What had to be done has been done, which is simply seeing through the work to allow seeing through. So there's a story in the Samyutta Nikaya, which is basically the same story. And the finishing poem in that, which is Mara comes up and sees Kisagami post-awakening. He says, "What's going on? You look as if your child has died. You sit alone. Tears streak your face. You've come to the woods alone. Are you looking for a man?" Of course. So, of course, he's trying to do what he did to Buddha and he does to everybody, which is to try and lure him back away from this awakening thing. And Kisagami realized what was going on, and here's her response. "I have finished with the death of my child, and men belong to that past. I don't grieve. I don't cry. I'm not afraid of you, friend. Everywhere the love of pleasure is destroyed, the great dark is torn apart, and death, you too are destroyed. I don't grieve. I don't cry. I'm not afraid of you, friend." I find that an interesting word. I'm not afraid of you, friend. Why not? Everybody's a friend. In this place, there is no friend, no enemy. Everywhere the love of pleasure is destroyed. It's not pleasure. Pleasure's there. But it's the love of it. It's not the sensuality. It's the string of sensuality. It's holding on to it. This world is full of pleasure and pain, and that's fine. But it's the holding on that's the problem. Put it down. Everywhere the love of pleasure is destroyed, the great dark is torn apart, and death, you too are destroyed. There is no death. There is no more death, no more birth. It's just dissolved. So those are a couple of poems which we can revisit and reread. And I suspect the thing to do is to just, as we chat, I'll just pick one or two of them and reread them, and we'll talk about the poems. But I will first just pause and see what comes up for you by way of reflection or comment. Anyone? Beth?
I was thinking about how you pointed out how the love of mothers for their children is held up as and so then it's especially ironic that probably the biggest obstacle most of these women have to overcome is grief over loss of a child.
Yes.
And so, that is, points to the having that love, but without the attachment. It's having to let go of that. The other thing is,
thank you. That's a really deep point.
you're welcome. And one of the poems of Kisagami, when she was talking about, I interpreted the poem differently when she's talking about, to live among many wives and suffering. And he said, after the child is born, the beautiful young women kill themselves. I was thinking postpartum depression.
Yeah.
And that they killed themselves. Oh, and it sounded
It's intentionally ambiguous, I think. Yes, I agree. That is
Yeah,
absolutely a
yeah,
reading.
because, yeah, the idea of murder or scrambling had, it never occurred to me. That was the thing that came up to me is,
Unsupported postpartum depression.
yeah, yeah. And then the third thing, if I may,
Please.
it, in so many of, places I've come across where, men at that time thought women were just rapacious
Yeah,
in their, sensual desire. And it suddenly struck me as like, well, of course, that's their only route to any kind of safety, security, or power is through sex. So yeah, anytime,
sure.
they're with, of course they're going to appear that way because they're like, trying to make their way in the world.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. It's, I always wondered about that. It's like, why would they think that?
Well, it's a very what that to me is a very, very difficult point because well, for a lot of reasons, but a reason, and one I find it difficult, is as a man, it is very hard for me to talk about women trying to make themselves attractive to men and trying to seduce men, because it sort of feels like as a man, I'm then projecting a problem back on the woman.
Mhm.
But I do think that in this culture, and it's still the culture today, and it's actually the direct route of a lot of the, it's part of the direct route of a lot of the abuses by teachers of women.
Mhm.
Because yes, you've got this authoritarian male figure who is enlightened but not wise, if that makes sense, and shoes outside the door and all that. But that travesty doesn't work without something on the female side that moves into that. And it's, as I say, I've got to be very careful with that because it's very difficult, because it's that, I think some of it is that same social dynamic moving over to where men have the power. And what do you do when men have the power? It's very difficult for a man to talk about. Does that make any sense what I'm saying?
It does, but I'd say, whether the women are being titillating or absolutely not, there's certainly, plenty of cases where the men are predators.
I'm not excusing
Yeah.
the men in any way, and they are predators and their
I
abuses,
know.
the behavior is completely wrong. I agree
Right,
with
and
that.
I'm also trying to say that not all women are
I agree with that
trying
also.
to seduce.
And it's not even seduction. It's there's just a deeply trained cultural behavior in this uneven society that just shows up. It's very slippery, but I do think it's important. I don't know how we talk about it because it's very difficult. Anyone else, please? Ken.
Yeah, Gareth, I hadn't thought about it before, but if I remember the story correctly, when Siddhartha Gautama left his father's palace, he went out and what did he see? He saw a sick man.
Yeah.
He saw an old man. He saw a dead man. So this whole thing of suffering was so wrapped up in the male patriarchy culture of the time. Didn't he see any elderly or sick women?
That's I had not seen that either, Ken. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure they were kept away.
And it is deeply in their culture, even relatively recent. It is today, but two of my great teachers, Tanisara Bhikkhu, he's out of the Thai forest tradition out in California. He is to me the greatest living Pali scholar and a very wise man, and a deep practitioner. And then Ajahn Chah, which is my own lineage, Ajahn Chah, who is also Thai forest and passed away in 1980, 1990, something like that. So Tanisara Bhikkhu, he is very much a literalist in his readings of the Theravada, of the Pali Canon, which in this context means, as far as he's concerned, the Bhikkhuni lineage is dead. It's all over. So there's just no legitimate female monastic tradition with authorized female teachers. That lineage was broken and it's over. And then Ajahn Chah, who are just an astonishing human being, so profound, so insightful. He's talking, of course, in his Watts, which are his forest monasteries. He's talking to men. I mean, people will come visit. I'm sure there are female visitors, but it's just so deeply a male culture. And he talks of, attractions, and several times, maybe half a dozen times, his collected talks is like 1,000 pages, which is all that remains of his teachings. It's not even 1,000, it's more like 800. And maybe half a dozen times or more in there, he talks about the single most attractive thing, talking to the monks. He's saying, when you see a woman, isn't that just the most beautiful thing? Isn't that? It's just like, it's just hard to get away from. Kevin, and then Ken.
Thank you, guys. I think it's hard to get away from because it's hard to get away from.
Yeah.
And I think the conversation, you ask, how do we, it's difficult to have the conversation, but we should still try, because, those, you can call it hindrance, you can call it, reminders of doing no harm, whatever it is. But I think it's, when we go back and look, it's still, within our precepts, within the things that trip us up. And you're right, this is older than we are now. This hierarchy, this way of this attraction, and some of it you alluded to begin with, with the boundless compassion of the mother. And so, that has some influence as well too. So yeah, it's very complicated. I know it shows up for me a lot in my practice, and I really have to rely on the precepts sometimes just to remind myself of that. Is like, these situations are showing up all the time, and it can be quite harmful, certainly to me, but then whoever else is on the receiving end of, either unwanted attention or inappropriate attention or what have you. And so it's, it's worthwhile to discuss, because I think, like you said, it shows up everywhere. And, enlightened men are not immune to it. So,
right.
So for me, it really is the working with the precepts is kind of, that's the reminder against all that 200,000 years of biology that, we've got to deal with.
Yeah, and one of the there are many different Buddhist traditions which approach the path is still fundamentally the same path, and the endpoint is the same endpoint. If it can be called an endpoint, forgive me, it's not really an endpoint, but the release is still the same release. But the framework for the path, the structure that is used to navigate the path, is very different. And some of them, it's very much just jump right in and just sit and stare at a wall and wake up. And others, it's very detailed and very meticulous with lots of structure around understanding how the mind works. So it's really, what you're looking at there is a fairly sophisticated structure, and it goes right to the heart of the precepts, Kevin, which is what you bring up and why I follow up with this. It goes right to teaching us how to live an incrementally refined life here and now, how to incrementally recognize what living in this world for the release of suffering looks like. And only when we've mastered that are we able to make that, to do that final letting go and cross to the other shore, actually get on the other shore. So that as long as there is still this manifestation, it is a manifestation that is now deeply conditioned to act for the release of suffering. And we can pick to modern examples. Thich Nhat Hanh is the one I'll go to. But there are people who truly show up in this world so deeply conditioned to exist for the release of suffering that the kind of things we're talking about rarely show up, rarely if ever. And it does come from, as you're saying, Kevin, keep on regrounding ourselves in the precepts. We are here. Even with that, there's still this. Ken.
Yeah, well, Kevin pretty much touched upon what I was going to say anyway. Thank you, Kevin. Another example of this ingrained patriarchy in centuries, millennia past in Indian culture, I believe, Hindu, Sikh, or Buddhist culture, as a man aged, it was almost expected that he would abandon his family, his wife, and
Yes.
wander off into the forest to spend his remaining years in some kind of a spiritual paradise or whatever the thing was. I've often wondered, what about the family? What about the wife? I mean, looking at my own situation, I could not imagine doing something like that to Pam, to my wife. I could not imagine my father doing that to my mother. So, I mean, you really have to turn your back on a lot of the precepts, as Kevin mentioned, to do something like that. Gareth, to your knowledge, is that tradition still being done in India today?
To my knowledge, it is, to my knowledge, there is still recognition of the 4 ages, the 4 stages of life, and the 4th stage is that sannyas and the wandering off into the forest. I don't know is the honest answer to the extent to which it is deeply practiced. There really aren't, wild, untouched virgin forests anymore. I mean, everything has been clear cut and regrown. So there's not the places to go do this. I mean, the Thai forest tradition is dying out because there aren't any forests anymore.
Yeah.
So I don't, Clay, it looks like you may know something that I don't. Yeah.
I got curious about this too. And from what I understand, in the way that it is still practiced, it's kind of I'm going to live in a cottage in the backyard now kind of situation. That makes sense.
It does.
So it's become very suburbanized in
Yeah.
a way, kind of. So I don't know. I doubt that it's practiced in the way that Kim's referring to it now. In that we now kind of have a suburban asceticism.
And do you know whether that is widely practiced or is that just a sporadic practice?
That I don't.
Yeah.
But the few people that I do know from India, I've talked to about it. I've looked it up a little bit myself, but I'm not dedicated.
Yeah.
I can look into it while I'm down there, though.
Yeah, do actually do. That would be interesting. We've got a couple of people in a sangha who've spent many years living in India, so I might pick their brains as well. It's a really good question. But as a sidebar, living in a cottage in the backyard doesn't get there. Simply doesn't. Beth, did you have something?
Well, I was just gonna say, my understanding is what would happen to the wife when the man went off on his spiritual quest was she would go and reside with one of her sons, which is one of the important reasons to have a son, because you weren't welcome at your daughter's home because she left your family and she went and she's with another family, so you can't go stay with her. And if you didn't have any sons, or if they refused to do the right thing, then you were destitute and we're going to end in a very bad way.
Yeah. The what's the word? Mata. So there's 2 words. I'm going to see if I can. Well, I can't think of the first one. The second word is putra. So the role of a mother was a very important one, as we talked about. Just this role of mother, so that a lot of the time, after having had a son, a mother would be called mother of Gareth.
Yeah.
And there's a 2-syllable suffix
That's
to a
why
name.
Deepa Ma was called Deepa Ma. It means mother of
Yes.
Deepa. That was her daughter's name, Deepa.
Deepa Ma. But it's more true with the son, though, for the
Yeah.
kinds of reasons you're talking about.
Yeah.
And the other way it works is the son would often be named after the mother. Shariputra is son of Shari.
Mm.
And I hadn't thought about it, but it would come from the kind of relationship you're describing there. It's important to describe myself as Beth's son so that everybody knows when Beth gets old, she comes and is supported as my dependent.
Yeah.
That's interesting. We've got a few minutes left. Are there any poems or fragments of poems you'd like me to read and discuss for a few minutes?
Can you read the one about how the tears in your past lives fill up the floor?
Mm.
So there are 2 little snippets there. One was just the short verse from Kissagatami. Miserable woman, this pain can't be measured. Your tears have been falling for thousands of lives. And then I went from there back to the story of Patakara, where she went to see the Buddha and he said, "Sister, recover your presence of mind." And she did. She said, "Help me." And he said, "Patakara, don't think you have come to someone who can help you. In your many lives, you have shed more tears for the dead than there is water in the 4 oceans."
That did the trick.
And that did the trick. He carried on talking. The conversation went on. He went on to say that when she went to another world, no kin could help. That was basically the turning point. And it really goes to it picks up on something you said right at the beginning here, Beth, which is that the profundity of that love of a mother for a son, or for a child, is then reflected in the deep pain of loss of a child. The problem isn't the pain. The problem is holding the pain. Put it down. Put it down. If you don't put the pain down, you will fill up ocean after ocean, and you'll keep coming back and coming back and coming back and suffering and crying and suffering and crying. You've got to put it down. Beth.
I was thinking about what about that, you filled oceans and oceans. And I think that's related to Kissagatami.
It's a tongue twister. Say it twice fast.
No, thank you. She couldn't find a family that had experienced death.
Yeah.
And so for them, that was realizing reality as it is.
Yes.
And that everything dies.
And that.
And it has always been that way and will always be that way.
That's the way in. And then you have to realize, and therefore,
Yeah.
I have to put, there's nothing to hold on to here. This is just, there is nothing permanent. There is nothing I can hold on to. This pain is not real. There's actually nothing here to hold on to. So that's why you become the disciple of practice, but that's the way in.
Yeah.
What else, folks? Kevin.
And so is maybe for next time or advanced topics, I'm quite interested in how the story, the heroine archetype of Persephone and Demeter tie in with this same concept, and then with healing, that it's you know, we always go after things with the hero approach. You must go out and
Yeah.
face whatever fears you have and come back. But this other one, the returning to the earth and that, I only vaguely get it, and so I enjoy these stories because it seems more, you know, I won't say understandable, but I can relate to it better now at this point, and so you know there's a good practice there.
Yes,
Some things are confusing, you know, the concept of you know, unconditional love as it relates into Buddhism. You know, I don't get that often in the Pali Canon. I get it in these poems more, and you see that, and it's somewhat, you know, related to, yes, you know, this concept of universal suffering. Everyone's gone through this, and the way out of it is to, you know, somewhat realize that, but also come together. You know,
yeah.
in sangha. And so I've got just bits and pieces of it. So at some point, if you could help us put it together, I think that would be quite interesting.
That's a really interesting framing, Kevin. Thank you. I'll take that up as a challenge. It's a really beautiful framing of this. And Beth's sitting here nodding, so she'll remind me and help me figure that out. Thank you.
Get her perspective.
Yeah. You sounded like you had something a minute ago, Clay. You did?
I'm stuck on the phrase that nobody hears. No.
Yeah.
But then he does.
No, he doesn't. What he does is he shows her how to help herself. I can't take you there. I can show you the path. And I can point you off, and off you go. You've got to do it yourself. The practice is of, you know, if you want to think of it in these terms, you keep on picking up all these things that cause suffering. The practice is to put down all these things you're carrying and not to pick them up anymore. Nobody can do that for you. They can explain that to you. They can show you a path of practice that helps you learn how to do this. You have to do it yourself. Nobody can help you. Does that make sense? Well, we're about that time. If anybody has a closing thought, feel free to offer it. Or closing question. Otherwise, let us wrap up. Thank you, folks. Lovely conversation. See you all soon.